welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for, well, a pretty difficult journey. One that takes us right to the jagged intersection of psychology, biology, and just sheer deliberate evil.
It's a tough one. We're peering into the abyss, really.
We are, and we're confronting that chilling realization that some of the most dangerous, most fundamentally broken people on the planet, they look precisely like the successful executive or, the friendly neighbor.
Or the well-groomed all-American boy.
Exactly.
It's the ultimate lesson in the power of the mask. The mask of complete normalcy, that polished facade. It isn't just a disguise, right? It is, in fact, their primary hunting tool.
A tool. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, because as soon as you assume that outward plausibility equals moral reliability, well, that's when you become vulnerable. We're analyzing sources today that really penetrate this mask. They reveal the just astonishing effort these killers put into fabricating a life they never, ever earned.
And that's our mission. We're taking a deep, detailed dive into the case files of 3 serial predators, and this is all extracted from extensive correspondence and interviews with the offenders themselves.
Which gives us a unique window.
It really does. We're studying the methods of manipulation, the structures of their pathological lies, and the sheer brutality that defined. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi, the Hillside Strangler.
Arthur John Shawcross, the monster of the rivers.
And John David Guy's Cannan, the very British monster.
Our goal here is kind of twofold. First, we want to unpack the precise psychological mechanics of extreme predation. But second, and I think this is just as critical, we need to understand the investigative tactics required to strip away their control.
That self-imposed control.
Exactly, to force a confrontation with reality. Because in these interviews, you learn very quickly that appealing to a killer's conscience or their better nature, it's always interpreted as weakness. And that's a mistake you just can't afford to make.
So, before we jump into Bianchi, we really need to set the intellectual groundwork here, because our sources draw a very clear, though nuanced distinction that sort of acts as the anchor for today's entire deep dive.
Psychopath versus savage.
Psychopath versus savage. And this isn't just semantics, is it? It's about intent. It's about responsibility.
Precisely. A psychopath is, clinically defined by a measurable set of traits. That profound lack of guilt, emotional hollowness, superficial charm. They are the supreme con artists.
Right.
Their condition, psychopathy, is often viewed as developmental or, even neurological. Sometimes that implies a deficiency that's beyond their control. They know society's rules, but they just override them because they fundamentally lack empathy. Their whole ethos is basically, I don't care, my desires trump all consequences.
But the savage is a different beast entirely. The savage is characterized primarily by brutal, unrestrained violence. The sheer quantum of brutality. And that's combined with a willful transgression of all societal rules.
And the sources are really blunt here. The term savage applies to those who exhibit that total disregard for what's acceptable. They possess what the sources refer to as no such excuse.
No such excuse.
None. They're driven by this aggressive narcissism, needing external admiration so desperately that any failure is met with immediate lethal violence. They make a choice to reject humanity, whereas, the psychopath might be seen as genetically pre-wired to lack it.
And that brings us to Kenneth Alessio Bianchi. Our first subject, the quintessential savage. This man, the notorious Hillside Strangler, he just embodies that specific strain of aggressive narcissism, the ultimate con man who actually believed his own lies. So let's unpack this need he had for superiority.
Bianchi's ego was not stable at all. It was, as the sources describe it, constantly hanging by a thread. He was pathologically driven by this need for external validation and was just absolutely terrified of being seen as inferior.
And that desperation just ramped up when he saw his peers finding success, didn't it?
Oh, completely. They were entering careers, finishing degrees, and he was just stumbling.
We see this struggle reflected so clearly in his academic record. He had this grandiose internal belief that he must excel in everything he undertook, yet reality showed he performed, dismally in college.
He even drew an incomplete in a basic psychology course. An incomplete.
The very field he would later claim to have mastered. The irony is just staggering.
So, when you have a man whose self-worth is entirely tied to external success, but he faces repeated internal failure, what does he do? He constructs an external narrative of success. He began fabricating multiple identities.
Starting in Los Angeles.
Right. In L.A., he crafted the role of Dr. Bianchi, a phony psychiatric counselor. And this wasn't just, a brief lie he told at a party. This was an entire elaborate fiction.
And he mastered the art of window dressing, as he called it.
He did. He rented an office, joined a book club, and crucially, he filled his shelves with specific current literature on psychology. He wasn't just looking for props. He was looking for current trends.
Which is how that Billy Milligan book ended up on his shelf.
Exactly. He conspicuously displayed the book about the famous multiple personality disorder case of Billy Milligan. He was, in effect, setting the stage years in advance for the ultimate con he would attempt later on.
And he didn't just use props. I mean, he was an aggressive fraudster, acquiring genuine credentials through, well, deception.
Oh, absolutely. When students would apply for jobs with him, the fake Dr. Bianchi, he would literally steal their genuine diplomas through various sleight-of-hand techniques.
Unbelievable.
Then he'd forge letters from prestigious institutions, thanking him for his generosity and his enlightening lectures. This wasn't just lying. This was crafting a parallel, entirely fictional biography designed solely to get admiration.
So what happens when the phony practice fails to attract paying clients? Because even a brilliant con man needs revenue.
Well, he simply packed up the facade and moved on. He reinvented himself again, this time as Captain Bianchi, a security guard in Bellingham, Washington state.
Of course, he didn't just become a guard, he gave himself rank.
Always projecting authority and success, even in a low-status job. And it was there, in Bellingham, that his savage nature fully erupted. He murdered 2 co-eds, adding to the list of killings he'd already committed with his half-cousin, Angela Buono, back in L.A.
He's facing a capital murder charge. The gallows. The facade had failed spectacularly.
And this is the moment the savage pivots. He pivots from external fabrication to internal legal fabrication. His attorney, a man named Dean Brett, advised him that the only way to avoid execution was a not guilty by reason of insanity plea.
Specifically targeting multiple personality disorder, MPD.
The most sensational diagnosis he could possibly choose.
And the preparation for this role was, it was meticulous, wasn't it? The sources point out he had watched the highly publicized miniseries Sybil.
Yes, which detailed a famous case of MPD. It was like his homework. It allowed him to absorb the necessary mannerisms, the narrative structure, and, the emotional shifts he'd need for the performance.
So the stage is set for this grand deception.
Completely. The defense brought in Dr. John Watkins, a highly respected and, legitimate forensic psychiatrist known for his work in the field. This gave immediate credibility to the whole forthcoming theatrical performance.
And during the hypnosis sessions, the alter ego appears.
Steve Walker. He made his grand entrance.
And Steve Walker was not a shrinking violet. He was the savage id, right? Speaking in a low, sneering, aggressive voice, claiming to hate Ken, the good boy.
Exactly. He confessed to the L.A. murders with Buono, describing the acts with just this chilling indifference.
And he confirmed the depths of the savagery.
He did. Killing any fucking body doesn't make any difference to me. Angelo is my kind of man. Dr. Watkins was convinced. He theorized that Bianchi, unable to express hatred for his adoptive mother, had subconsciously created Steve to externalize his violence and remain the loving, devoted son.
The role Ken so desperately needed to maintain.
The defense's MPD strategy immediately leaked to the press. The headlines were sensational, which, of course, infuriated the trial judge, Judge Kurtz.
He could smell a con job.
He wasn't going to let his courtroom become a stage, so he called in a panel of independent experts to evaluate Bianchi's mental state and, as one Officer Riley put it, sort out the bullshit from the bullshit.
This is where the story shifts, doesn't it? From Bianchi the con man to Dr. Martin Orne, the master investigator.
Oh, absolutely. Orne was deeply skeptical of the sudden appearance of MPD. It's a condition that's rarely seen in individuals without deep established psychological histories, and certainly not one that's prepped by watching a TV show.
So Orne's task was simple.
Deceptively simple. Test whether Bianchi was genuinely hypnotized and dissociating or whether he was just role-playing.
And the test devised by Orne was just elegant in its simplicity.
It was brilliant. Bianchi had already introduced another alter ego, Billy. So Orne first asked Billy to speak to his non-existent invisible lawyer.
And Bianchi, he commits to the role perfectly.
Enthusiastically, he leaned across the table and shook the hand of this non-existent figure. Perfect commitment.
But the dramatic moment came next.
Right. Dr. Orne instructed Bianchi to maintain the illusion of the invisible lawyer. And then, very discreetly, he had Dean Brett, Ken's real lawyer, walk into the room. This introduced a cognitive conflict that only a genuine hypnotically induced alter could resolve without breaking character.
And the con just collapsed instantly.
Instantly, Billy saw the real lawyer and immediately shifted his focus, asking, how can I see him in two places?
Which is the one thing a truly hypnotized person wouldn't question.
Exactly. The genuine hypnotized mind would just accept the reality dictated by the hypnotist that the invisible man was there. A conscious actor, pretending to be Billy, couldn't reconcile the presence of the real person with the non-existent one without admitting the whole pretense.
That was the aha moment that saved the justice system.
It was. Bianchi was deemed mentally competent and exposed as a fraudster, not a victim of a dissociative condition. And, the ultimate irony for the supposed con man supremo, Professor Linde, who originally suggested the hypnosis, he had to concede Bianchi could have been faking. But even then, he couldn't grasp the scale of it. He suggested Bianchi was not psychologically sophisticated enough, nor is he intelligent enough to have constructed such an elaborate history.
So he was smart enough to plan the con, but just too narcissistic to execute the fake hypnosis flawlessly.
Precisely.
Bianchi later pleaded guilty, testified against Buono.
But even facing life in prison, that narcissistic engine never stops, does it? We should probably mention his post-conviction behavior because it is so revealing of what you call that elephant's fly mindset.
Oh, it's incredible. Even locked away, Bianchi continued seeking validation, recognition, and critically control. He actually sued the American Bar Association.
And a playing card company. For breaching his copyright and using his picture without permission. Imagine that level of grandiosity. A condemned serial killer, supported by the Washington State Department of Corrections, seeking legal redress for his image rights.
The savage is incarcerated, but the narcissistic need for status and recognition
remains perpetually active, always looking for a way to assert superiority.
So if Bianchi demonstrates the horrifying depths of psychological fraud and willful transgression, the savage, we now need to move to a vastly different profile. This is one that provoked serious attempts to find a biological answer for the descent into psychopathic violence. Arthur John Shawcross, the monster of the rivers.
Shawcross is a critical case for understanding that search for biological determinism in criminality. He was a textbook psychopath, no remorse, capable of superficial charm, brutally violent. But his case introduced two fascinating and very complex biochemical factors into the court records.
The alleged XYY chromosome anomaly and, maybe more compellingly, the presence of cryptopyrrole.
That's right.
Let's start with the XYY chromosome. It was often sensationalized back in the mid-20th century as the Superman problem. We should probably clarify this for you listening.
We should. The standard male genetic structure is XY. An XYY male carries an extra Y chromosome in every cell, giving them 47 chromosomes instead of 46. And while it was initially linked to this, overly aggressive super male behavior, the consensus has evolved a bit.
But the data cited in our sources is still pretty significant.
It is. XYY males show up to a 20-fold increased risk of institutionalization in prisons or mental hospitals compared to the general population. It's certainly a massive statistical risk factor, but it's not a direct cause of criminality. It's a correlation, not causation.
But the truly fascinating element of Shawcross's biological profile was that second factor, the biochemical imbalance involving cryptopyrrole. The name itself is evocative. It's Greek for hidden fiery oil.
It sounds like something out of a pulp novel, doesn't it? But this chemical is extremely real and highly relevant to violent behavior. Cryptopyrrole chemically resembles compounds known to be toxic to brain function. It even has structural similarities to LSD. When it's present in excess, it's strongly implicated in profound metabolic defects.
And the data for Shawcross was, it was off the charts. His urine readings for cryptopyrrole showed a colossal 200.66 milli 100 cc.
And to put that into perspective for you, a reading of just 20 millicg 100 cc is already considered dangerously elevated. It's a sign of clinical concern.
So he was operating at 10 times the warning level.
This defect is called pyroluria, and the scientific implications are profound. When cryptopyrrole is overproduced, it tightly binds to and excretes two absolutely critical micronutrients, zinc and vitamin B6.
And why are zinc and B6 so important for behavior? What's the mechanism there?
Well, they're vital cofactors for the synthesis and regulation of major neurotransmitters, particularly serotonin and GABA. Serotonin is essential for impulse control, emotional regulation, mood stability. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's what puts the brakes on excitability and anxiety.
So if you have a severe deficiency in B6 and zinc because of this pyroluria, You are fundamentally undermining your brain's ability to regulate mood, control impulse, and process stress.
So Shawcross's extreme pyroluria wasn't just some odd data point. It was a physical mechanism directly correlated with the symptoms he exhibited: marked irritability, severe rages, uncontrollable mood swings, violence, and profound psychopathic behavior.
He was quite literally a human time bomb where a minor stressor could ignite a catastrophic biochemical reaction.
And this brings us to the monumental failure of the system.
It really does. Pyrolurics function best in highly controlled, low-stress environments with predictable routines. They often require therapeutic doses of zinc and B6. Guess what fits that description perfectly?
The correctional system.
Exactly. He became the definition of the model prisoner. Shawcross, convicted in the early 70s for the horrific murders of 10-year-old Jack Blake and 12-year-old Cannan Hill, crimes that involved acts of cannibalism, he manipulated the prison system masterfully.
He was a total chameleon. He got his high school equivalency, learned carpentry, but most critically, he became fluent in psychiatric language. He understood the buzzwords, the diagnostic criteria, and how to articulate a narrative of change.
He even managed to get a coveted counselor's job in the prison's mental health unit.
Right, putting him in a position of apparent trust and responsibility. It's just staggering.
The mask was flawless. So he was released in 1987, a full 10 years before his non-parole tariff was complete. But this time, the warning signs were flashing bright red.
They were deafening. While one faction of psychiatrists was lauding his progress, others saw right through the act. Senior parole officers and psychiatrists, like Dr. Robert T. Kent and Dr. Javiwala, issued dire warnings. Kent stated that Shawcross was possibly the most dangerous individual to have been released to this community in years,
citing his deeply ingrained antisocial and psychosexual disorders.
And yet, the system failed spectacularly. Despite these high-level warnings, he was released, and he immediately defaulted to his core programming. Between 1988 and 1989, Shawcross went on a spree, killing at least 9 other women near the Genesee River in Rochester, New York.
The outcome was, sadly, completely predictable, given his psychological profile and his unchecked biochemical triggers.
It was a catastrophic preventable failure. It was rooted in the system's inability to distinguish genuine reform from expert manipulation. Judge Wisner, upon his reconviction, publicly condemned the original prosecution in the 70s as rank amateurs for accepting a lesser charge. It highlighted how the superficial charm of the psychopath had derailed justice decades earlier.
And that sets the stage perfectly for our next section, because the subsequent investigation required this extraordinary psychological judo to secure confessions for those initial 2 murders, Jack Blake and Cannan Hill, which were still technically unresolved decades later.
This is the art of manipulating the manipulator. A stunning demonstration of mind control against a narcissist.
It's a textbook lesson, really, in how to deal with a high-functioning psychopath. You can't appeal to their morality or their guilt.
No, you have to appeal to their vanity, their sense of control, and specifically in Shawcross's case, their current status.
The leverage was his impending marriage. Shawcross was engaged to a woman named Clara Neal, who was profoundly naive about his past. She described him as wonderfully gentle. She even believed his violent tendencies could just be managed with medication.
So the interviewer, recognizing this relationship, was the one thing Shawcross valued: his social validation offered, tongue-in-cheek, to be his best man.
He established trust by participating in the fantasy. But the true leverage was moral, though not directed at Shawcross's morality at all.
No, it was about Mary Blake, Jack's mother. She was terminally ill with cancer, and she still held on to this desperate hope that her 10-year-old son might just come home one day because Shawcross had never actually confessed. The priority was getting closure for Mary before she died.
So the interviewer visited Mary Blake. She cleaned her home, served tea, and spoke with this aching certainty that her son would eventually return. And that interaction gave the interviewer the emotional ammunition he needed to confront this stone-cold killer.
So when the interviewer returned to Shawcross, the confrontation was direct. He raised the topic of Jack Blake, and Shawcross's mask just immediately cracked. He wasn't charming anymore. He was a snarling bully. He spat out, "You don't know who you're dealing with, fuckface."
The psychopath, threatened, reverts to aggressive dominance.
But the interviewer knew better than to match that aggression. Instead, he pulled the final lever: Clara. He held his ground and reminded Shawcross of the good person waiting outside for him, the fiancé who validated his status as a successful reformed man.
He looked the killer dead in the eye and said, "Don't let her down. You're finally getting something good in your life."
It was an appeal not to compassion, but to ego and future stability. The interviewer physically closed the gap, offered a slight, non-threatening touch-in maneuver designed to increase emotional intimacy in that moment, and whispered, emphasizing the one thing Shawcross feared losing.
His status.
"Arthur, Clara loves you so much, don't let her down."
And the resistance just broke. The defiance was replaced by confusion, the mask slipped completely, and the dam burst. Shawcross confessed to killing Jack Blake.
Yeah, I killed him. Okay, I told him Jack to go home, and he wouldn't, and then I got kind of mad at him.
The confession details revealed the chilling logic of the predator. When asked about Jack's clothes, Shawcross admitted forcing the boy to fold them up perfectly. Why?
To keep him shut up. Let him think that he's going to put him on again.
It was a cold, calculated act of control, offering the victim a false promise of life right up to the final moment.
And confession for Cannan Hill was similarly devoid of emotion, just filtered through his own self-serving narrative. Exactly. He claimed she kind of wanted it, sex and stuff like that. Then I get started and she starts crying and wants her mom, so I suffocated her. He confirmed the sexual assault was post-mortem, which is a common factor in psychosexual murders. It indicates the violence was the primary drive, not the arousal.
The interview culminated in a moment of forced closure. Shawcross looked into the camera, and with this sort of robotic obedience, he apologized to Mary Blake, confirming that Jack would never be coming home. A brief flicker of performative remorse for the camera.
But the immediate aftermath proves the purely egotistical success of the manipulation. The moment he was back in his cell, he didn't reflect on the victims or his actions. He bragged about the interview and about the interviewer becoming his best man.
So he was immediately thrown into prison segregation.
Not for showing remorse, but because his bragging caused a disruption. For the psychopath, the reward is always the act of control and the resulting validation, never moral redemption.
We've examined Bianchi, the savage, driven by narcissistic pretense, and Shawcross, the psychopath potentially driven by biological anomalies and systemic failure. Now we turn to our third case study, one who beautifully combines the pathological lying of Bianchi with the brutal sexual predatory nature of the savage. John David Guise Cannan, the very British monster.
Cannan is just a classic example of aggressive narcissism manifesting as a career in fraud and sexual violence. On the surface, he was the picture of conventional success. Smart suit, polished shoes, impeccable manners, projecting charm. But beneath that thin veneer, his associates knew the truth. They branded him oily, smarmy, and a lech.
His life was just this dizzying structure of absolute fabrication, all designed to achieve one purpose: attracting women of status who possessed the things he could only lie about having.
Right. He targeted women like Annabelle Rose, who was a solicitor, and Gilly Page, an ice show beauty.
His nicknames tell the story perfectly: Billy Liar, Top Gun, and Big Head, Big Mouth.
He lied about everything: his education, his wealth, his prestige, his success as a car dealer. His need for admiration was so total that when he was interviewed, he went out of his way to flatter the investigator, discussing his Jaguar and his preference for Remy Martin cognac over Cheapo Blanc. He was subtly demanding that the interviewer respect his supposed sophisticated taste.
And that need for external validation, that aggressive narcissism, it underpinned his savagery. His world started to crumble in 1987 when he was arrested following an attempted robbery and rape in Leamington Spa. And when police searched his black BMW, they didn't just find incidental evidence.
No, they found the blueprint for his modus operandi, what became known as his rape kit.
The contents were chillingly methodical. A champagne cork.
A length of rope, a clothesline still in its factory packaging, and a pair of handcuffs. These items were not random. They represented control, the promise of celebration with the champagne, and the tools of incapacitation needed to commit sexual assault.
And his explanation for these items was classic pathological lying. She didn't deny they were there. He just minimized their significance and invented these ludicrous backstories.
For the clothesline, which was still wrapped in plastic, he claimed his line at home had broken, and he kept the packaged one in the car to prove he genuinely bought a replacement. The handcuffs, they were just dismissed with a knowing wink and a declaration that it was a long and complicated story he couldn't possibly divulge.
He flatly denied any intent to commit rape, despite having a history of sexual assault, including against a pregnant shop owner. He was trying to use his charm and his supposed sophistication to distract the interviewer from the overwhelming physical evidence.
He demanded the interviewer ignore the evidence and focus on his status. But his highly cultivated web of deceit began to unravel because of the most mundane, insignificant piece of physical detritus imaginable.
Parking ticket.
A parking ticket. This is where the investigator's diligence really pays off.
So Cannan was a suspect in the disappearance and murder of Sandra Court, who was killed in Bournemouth on May 3, 1986. And Cannan categorically denied ever being in Bournemouth on that specific date. He was adamant.
His denial was flawless, polished, and designed to shut down that line of inquiry entirely.
But the investigator, meticulously sifting through Cannan's personal property that had been retained at the police station, probably just trash to Cannan, found a crumpled, unremarkable pay-in-display parking ticket.
And that single piece of paper proved absolutely and irrevocably that Cannan was lying. The ticket contained the precise time, the precise date, and the precise location of a public car park in Bournemouth, May 3, 1986. This was the aha moment. It wasn't forensic evidence that brought him down initially. It was his inability to resist being seen as this organized, high-flying man who kept records, coupled with his pathological need to deny any proximity to his crimes.
And this detail exposed his deceit and quickly cemented him as a suspect in other unsolved disappearances, leading directly to the chilling Susie Lamplow connection. Cannan was never charged with her murder, but police named him as the prime suspect.
The parking ticket provided the necessary motive to dig deeper into Cannan's movements. Police focused on a specific vehicle he frequently borrowed, a red Ford Sierra belonging to a hostile cook. It was a car he used for everything, from visiting his girlfriend Annabelle Rose to attending car auctions.
The cook had passed away, and tracing the car was a needle-in-a-haystack operation, but the police succeeded. They traced the vehicle all the way to a London scrapyard.
And forensic examination of the scraped car yielded the DNA evidence police had long suspected was there. They discovered both Cannan's DNA and Susie Lamplow's DNA inside the vehicle. Though the link to Sandra Court wasn't forensically sought in the same way, the combined evidence from the parking ticket and the DNA confirmed Cannan's role as the British monster.
A savage whose veneer of sophistication hid this brutal sexual violence. And Cannan even alluded to his involvement by mentioning the mysterious client, Mr. Kipper, a nickname referencing his signature-wide Kipper-style ties.
What's so tragic and fascinating about Cannan is that his downfall was engineered by the very aggressive narcissism he cultivated. His ego was so fragile that any setback, like a breakup with Sharon Major or rejection from Annabelle Rose, translated into reckless criminal behavior. He truly believed his fabricated image gave him a right to entitlement and compliance from women.
He was Billy Liar to the bitter end.
Oh, to the very end.
Yeah.
He even attempted to manipulate the investigator during the interview by offering this complex, self-serving scheme. He demanded $400,000 to fund his own private investigation into his innocence, complete with specialized equipment and a researcher. He was still trying to ignore the physical proof, like Shirley Banks' the thumbprint found in his flat. A discovery that proved his claim she'd never been there was just another lie. He sought control through complexity, hoping to overwhelm the simple facts.
Now that we've journeyed through the calculated pretension of Bianchi, the biological time bomb of Shawcross, and the narcissistic fraud of Cannan, we need to bring these threads together and synthesize the common characteristics that define this brand of incurable predation.
Well, the foundational commonality is extreme pathological lying, and it's driven by aggressive narcissism. All three were swindlers. They lived entirely within these constructed realities.
Right. Bianchi was the self-styled doctor and captain.
Shawcross was the reformed, devout model prisoner and counselor.
And Cannan was the wealthy, sophisticated executive.
And the engine powering all this deceit was that aggressive narcissism, the ego constantly hanging by a thread. When they were confronted with the gap between their grandiose self-image and reality, whether it was Bianchi's poor college performance, Shawcross's defiant exposure, or Cannan's rejection by women of status, the response was immediate, lethal violence.
They were also masters of selective manipulation, weren't they?
Yeah.
They understood precisely which lever to pull with which person.
Absolutely. Bianchi weaponized the sensation of MPD to try and avoid execution. Shawcross exploited his fiancée's love and the interviewer's promise of validation to gain the upper hand and confess on his own terms. Cannan used flattery and the projection of high status, the Jaguar, the Remy Martin, to disarm and seduce both victims and interviewers.
Which brings us directly back to the investigative countertactics. The brilliance of the police work wasn't in appeals to conscience, but in exploiting the killer's specific narcissistic needs.
Take Bianchi. His need was to be seen as intellectually superior, so the countertactic was to expose his intellectual fraud through that simple cognitive conflict of the invisible lawyer test. It forced him to admit he wasn't genuinely hypnotized or dissociating.
For Shawcross, the need was control and validation. The investigator succeeded by participating in his fantasy, the best man calm, but then strategically threatening the one thing that validated his current desirable status, his fiancée Clara. The threat of losing that status broke his defiance.
And with Cannan, the approach was continuous ego-stroking. By seeming to appreciate his supposed good taste, investigators kept him talking, kept him lying, and kept him feeling superior. And this protracted process ultimately led him to provide the very documents and clues that incriminated him, like that single damning parking ticket and the location of the borrowed Ford Sierra.
Ultimately, the source material forces us to accept a very uncomfortable stark conclusion. Psychopaths are generally incurable and savages cannot be tamed.
They cannot. And the real danger is the social camouflage. These cases prove that outward plausibility and charm are the most effective weapons these individuals possess. If experienced psychiatrists and parole board members struggled profoundly to spot the homicidal psychopath like Shawcross or the pathological narcissist like Bianchi, what chance do ordinary people have when confronted with that polished mask?
So as we conclude this deep dive, the lesson really transcends forensic psychology and enters the realm of essential human caution. We've analyzed 3 different paths into the abyss: the calculated pretense of the conman supremo Bianchi,
The systemic failure regarding the human time bomb that was Shawcross,
and the narcissistic fraud of the British monster Cannan.
and they teach us that charm is not credibility. We have to learn to look past the suit, the polished shoes, and the glib flattery to see the fragile, aggressive ego that's simmering just beneath. The warning cited in our sources remains profoundly relevant. The naive person believes every word, but the shrewd one ponders each step.
And this naturally brings us back to the initial exploration of Shawcross's fascinating and frankly terrifying biochemistry. We established that his extreme XYY and cryptopyral readings correlated directly with his violent psychopathic behavior, functioning as a physiological trigger for uncontrollable rage.
Which raises one of the most pressing, terrifying ethical dilemmas for the future. If advances in genetics and neurobiology could, with definitive certainty, pinpoint a biological marker, like those extreme readings, that predisposed a person to such violence before they committed a crime, should society intervene?
Should they be involuntarily treated or detained based on potential scientifically backed future threat?
I mean, if you can theoretically identify the human time bomb with absolute certainty, does the complexity of human life and context, the fact that criminal behavior is always complex, even with biological predispositions, does that prevent us from ever predicting a killer with enough certainty to justify preemptive action?
It challenges the very foundation of free will and justice. We rely on the commission of a crime to trigger the judicial system.
But if the science evolved to bypass that necessity, what's the moral cost of prevention? That is the line of inquiry these 3 dark profiles force us to confront.
Something profound to ponder as you reflect on the sheer scale of the deception we've uncovered today. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.